This is part 3 of the video lecture for Chapter 2. At the end of part 2, I was talking about ways in which the biases of an observer could creep into the example involving the observation of patrons at a particular bar. There can be other ways in which these biases can creep into the researcher's observations. One of the biases that is mentioned could be a gender bias, where at least historically the idea of conducting research was something that was expected of men and not necessarily of women. Now it begs the larger question of why that actually happened, and it would mean going off on something of a tangent, but at least in this particular country it seems like those individuals who have had power in our society tend to be male. Whether or not that's valid is one thing. Whether or not it should continue is still another thing. But behind that, what you see is feminist methodology, which is to challenge the notion that, in a simplistic way, only men do research. Feminist methodology may not necessarily say that only women do research. Rather, its goal may be more along the lines of trying to open up the possibility of research. Consider another dimension, that research is done only by people who identify as white. Well, while it's not feminist methodology, you nonetheless may end up seeing individuals arguing that you should see more research from people who identify as African American, for example, or people who end up identifying as Asian. So in that way, you may end up seeing that there is more of a diversity. I think that a risk exists of characterizing feminist methodology as being something that says it is in competition with the traditional model. Rather, consider it instead as something that is in addition to the existing model. Now, when I talked about the classical experimental design, that is a design where you have a control group and experimental group, and that there's random assignment of the item that you're testing, in my example, a new medicine, such that the person who distributes this new medicine has no idea which one is which. There may be other ways in which you can go about testing a theory. One of the things that may be a complicating factor is to conduct, say, a survey. But the problem is giving the survey to the population that you most want to study. The problem? Too many people. It may not be practical to be able to distribute that study. That being said, one of the alternatives might be to look at a section of that representative population. That section that ends up having the characteristics most in common with the population that you want to study. Call that section a sample. Now there's a real risk, of course, and things have to be kept in mind when it comes to getting a sample that you want to study. You want to make sure that in the idea of representativeness, you're talking about individuals who randomly could broadly reflect the population you want to study. More significantly, you want to make sure that the sample itself does not necessarily detect some kind of bias on the part of the researcher when it came to selecting the sample. There are different ways around this. For example, if you look at your potential sample population, you might want to use a random number generator, assign the numbers to individuals, and then just on the basis of what the generator's outcome is, pick people who would end up being part of the sample. But in any case, as a practical matter, sampling may make studying of a phenomena at least cost manageable. There may be other ways of being able to detect data. For example, I've talked about participant observation, my example of the researcher in the bar. But there are other ways to get data. Interviewing individuals may be a valid approach. Sure, it's a qualitative research method, that is, the ability to compare the interview of one individual versus another's may be difficult because what are the criteria that you're using to compare them with? Not impossible. You might want to talk about how long the individuals took to answer questions, something like that. But in terms of the quality of the content, that may be more difficult. The other thing about using an interview is that it may be that the researcher can end up picking on a particular point and emphasizing this. So, for example, consider the idea of a deposition. In the legal field, when there's a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit, so that the loser, the defendant, with any luck, ends up paying money or damages to the plaintiff, there's a lot of activity that takes place before the case actually gets to trial. In fact, both parties may end up wanting to avoid trial. But leading up to the trial itself, both parties are going to want to gather all the information that they can from one another so that it's possible to go into court and get straight to the issues that need to be litigated. One of the methods of gathering data is a process called a deposition. And that's when we have somebody, whether a lawyer for plaintiff or defendant, asks a series of questions to individuals. While the questions may end up being general to start, you may see that the deposition takes a turn when individuals start to answer, and that the person who is asking the questions realize there's an opportunity to probe further. So much like with an interview, taking a deposition gives the opportunity to the questioner to be able to shift focus when gathering information. We've talked about survey research and the problems that may come with that at the very beginning. For example, the researcher discovered that conducting the survey was impractical. Surveys have, however, as a virtue, the possibility that you end up having a quantitative result. So you've probably filled out surveys where you have options that cause you to choose amongst a range of potential options. The nice thing about that is that for the researcher, you can end up taking the choices and measuring or comparing them amongst the broad population. So that's almost a classic example of quantitative research. We can even have a specialized kind of a survey. Generally speaking, survey research is done at the same time, roughly speaking, so that the population that you're talking to is unchanged by the passage of time. We can, however, have survey research of a group over a span of time. This is known as longitudinal research. The idea behind this is, in effect, a series of cross-sections are studied over a span of time, so that we may end up having the particular cross-sections practically not change. All that's changing is the passage of time. Other ways to gather data could include historical methods. That is, consulting historical records. So in that particular instance, we may have researchers going to things like newspapers to study how a phenomena unfurled in a particular society. That if you want to study the effects of, say, assassination on a particular society, you might want to look at the newspapers that come out the day after the killing of the individual to end up studying the societal reaction to it. Newspapers may end up varying reporting on this, and so you may end up finding that the differences may have some meaning about the impact of the death on a larger society. The other nice thing about historical research is that it tends to be cheap because you're looking at data that's already been gathered. So whether or not it's something like a newspaper or video or something that has already been made into a permanent form, someone else made that so that the researcher does not necessarily have to secure funding to be able to generate that information. Still, a further example of being able to collect data is through something like comparative research, where you have two cases and you look for particular instances. The example that the author makes in the book is looking at the history of France and Germany. When you started to see those nations in modern times, you saw that they came from different backgrounds. Already in Germany, you saw a tradition of the states that make up the German nation having a history of defining themselves and thinking of themselves as an independent entity. The problem for France, however, is that you had not seen this idea of self-organization ahead of time. So by studying the process, for example, of how you create a central government that's able to assess a tax, may be more complicated in France than in Germany, but there's the nature of the comparative research. Is it just because the French had a difficult time in forming a nation that could account for potentially a difference when it came down to collecting a tax? The author also mentions experimentation, and we've talked about that. With experimentation, you generally can come up with quantitative data which lends itself to some sort of statistical evaluation. You could also engage in content analysis. And the idea behind content analysis is not to look at so much the way in which a message is delivered, but to look at the content of the particular message, if we were to talk about something like communication. The idea would be then to engage in a systematic analysis of content. So, for example, if you end up seeing a sudden change in a bad political situation, you may want to survey the different individuals who are involved and find out what they said as a result of this abrupt change to be able to figure out what's going on. In effect, then you're engaging in content analysis. With research, especially when you're doing research involving people, the risk exists that some untoward conduct occurs and people could get hurt. As a result, we'll see that research has to abide by certain ethical standards when you're dealing with people. Some of these standards are fairly obvious. The first, of course, is do no harm. The idea is that at no point can research be justified where it does cause pain to an individual. There are, unfortunately, quite a few examples of that in at least American history and, of course, in other nations as well. Excuse me. A classic example happened in the 1950s when the United States, in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, wanted to better understand the effects of radioactive elements, perhaps for the benefit of being able to figure out if in fact soldiers are deployed in a situation where an atomic weapon was used, what's going to be the effects upon the soldiers that are deployed. What you saw was that various types of radioactive elements were slipped into the food of people who were being kept in a state institution in Massachusetts, involving people who were developmentally disabled. It was worse because these individuals were told that they were ingesting this radioactive compound, but that they were doing it for the purposes of being able to advance the struggle against the Soviet Union. Technically that was true, but what you ended up seeing there is, of course, that only part of the information was being disclosed. And that raises the second ethical concern of informed consent, that if you are dealing with people, it has to be clear that these people understand that there are certain risks involved, and that even in spite of those risks, these individuals continue to want to be a volunteer or subject of a particular type of research. The problem with ethics can't be overstated. Whether you're looking at a situation that happened, say, in the 1930s in the American South, where we saw that individuals were promised health care when in fact we're looking at a group of individuals who had a sexually transmitted disease, and even though a cure existed for it, these individuals were not given treatment so as to study the effects. That inhumane kind of condition is one of the reasons why ethics is now so much in the forefront of any kind of research involving people. In fact, you'll see ethics coming from different perspectives. You might see that organizations like the American Sociological Association will come up with ethical standards so that members of that organization agree to abide by those standards when engaging in research. Or you may end up seeing another type of organization imposing ethical standards, say for example for research that's being done on the campus of Bridgewater State. If that involves research in people, what you need to do is have an independent board evaluate the conditions of the research to see whether or not someone was harmed, could be harmed, and whether or not this person could engage in informed consent. The idea that there's this independent board takes the form of, indeed, an independent review board, IRB, whose job it is to make sure that ethical standards are upheld. When I conducted some research several years ago, before I could distribute my survey, I had to subject it to the IRB to get their approval that the research that I wanted to conduct using that survey met ethical standards. The final thought to consider here involves a phenomenon called public sociology. The idea behind public sociology has to do with trying to break down barriers that may exist between conducting research amongst individuals and the public, that there's a perception that the research is something that is best kept within the hands of researchers, and that the public may end up getting the benefits of that kind of work, but itself would not have a good sense of how these things unfold. Public sociology suggests that it's more important to be able to study how information is used, look at the ways in which information is disseminated. So, for example, if you end up getting research that suggests that abstinence reduces the rate of teen pregnancy, that may be well and good. But it may turn out that the research demonstrates that once we do have these individuals engaging in sexual activity, abstinence is no better a way than to prevent unwanted pregnancy. From a political perspective, you may want to emphasize